we go. This is set up yellow. Shall we all get started? Yeah? Thank you. I can't make this any bigger.
So I've checked that first is a practical, then the lecture, and then another practical.
It is first practical after all. I also thought so, but Frans just told me it should be first lecture. So, I mean, I don't think people are going to start to tune in if they think this is first practical. So, just do the practical first then. And we'll also.
So you're doing practical on the chi-square test?
The practical on the chi-square test should be after the lecture.
Okay.
So just work on what you already have.
Like extra time assignments and actual solving.
I will be walking around still here, like if you have any questions and something is not clear. So yeah, at 10 o'clock then we will start with the actual lecture.
I really
Everything. Oh,
I know. I wasn't bad at
that's
it.
okay. That's very good.
Where are you from?
From the first.
Oh, she's from the country. Where are you from? I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm good with languages. It's not that. I need to.
Ietsjes volgens mij op de ja. De bieden.
Ja, dus dat is gisteren staan, op laatst. Toen hier. Oké, onder deze. Ja.
Ja, nee, ik zit dus de hele tijd te kijken in dat.
Daar staat gewoon in de.
Oké, want gisteren zag ik ook wat Matthijs. Jij dat ook? Ja, wordt. En je zit zo even te lezen, dan kan je luisteren. Het is gewoon niet zo moeilijk.
Everything going well with the assignment so far?
Yeah, I try to do the more difficult assignments, but the problem is like I'm not used to R, so even if I Google like the right function, I usually don't know how to properly use it. So that like stops me from actually doing the exercises, the more difficult
The
ones.
more, yeah, okay. What actually helps is, I think did you learn how to use the help file yet? Like, you can...
The swirl?
No, not the swirl, but the help file in R. You have a tab called help.
Okay.
And you can find a function, but what's very nice about the tab is that it also at the end, it gives you examples of how they use the function.
Okay.
So then you can just look like, for instance, with a function called EMEs, which does pairwise comparison. You can just look, oh, they put in first a model, and then in the next argument they put in the variable that they want to compare with each other. So at least for me, that always helps to like have an example in how people are using it, you know?
So it's the help tab.
Yeah, do you have R open? But yeah, Googling is also always my go-to if something doesn't work. So
But it gives you a lot of information at once, and you don't know where to
yeah,
start.
exactly. It gives you like an overview with all those arguments, right? And that can be very confusing, especially the language that they sometimes use. They're not always very, how do you say it, straightforward.
It's very confusing
Yeah.
sometimes. Are you doing a PhD?
No, I'm still wrapping up my master. So I did the same master as you guys. So I also did the biology master, and after that I did the statistics master.
Oh, cool.
Yes, and for that I'm like in the very final stage of my thesis. So almost done.
Is it going well?
It is very, yeah, it's going very well. I will likely even make a publication of it. So
Nice.
that is always nice.
Yeah.
Which of the specialization do you do?
Molecular genetics.
Ah, that one is the best one by name.
I hope so, but right now I'm really not sure because all the presentations so far have been kind of boring.
I feel you.
Thank you.
Although I'm on from cells to organisms specialization.
I was also from cells to organisms.
I was wondering like if I should do that because I really like developmental biology.
The difference between these two actually is that from cells to organism has the freedom to like choose any of the course from the
That's
specialization.
what everyone said.
That's the only difference between them. But if I'm being honest, I like the name of that one better. So
Actually, we have a new name now. It's molecular cellular organismal
that's
biology.
much better.
Because I did a bachelor's in zoology, which allows you to do genetics.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
lab work, but if you say I did zoology, people think you studied animal care, and it was really difficult to get a lab job at home. Even though I spent all of my hours
They just look at your CV, just at the title, and they don't really know what you did.
Go work in a zoo, and we don't even have a zoo in Luxembourg, And I'm like, I worked in a lab,
Yeah.
So this is why I chose this specific specialization.
Yeah, I completely understand.
It says, I think the title says.
It's very fancy, yeah.
She's worked in a lab, And I like genetics, I love genetics, but I don't know. I think this is very new to me, so maybe.
I think one of the courses that is mandatory for you is mechanism of disease, and most of you will also pick it in your second year. I think you will.
Second year this year.
Yeah, really sure. You have, I think, at the same time evolution and development. Both of these courses are extremely good, but I like mechanism of disease a little bit better. Yeah, but like also do the other one if you have time. It's also a good course.
I do draw this semester to be able to do the evolution and development one.
Yeah.
Can I do mechanisms of disease next year?
Yeah, you can do it next year. You can just.
I was heartbroken. I was like, no.
No, you
Yeah, I
just
also
have
like to
to.
do it first.
You just have to be able to schedule it in. So likely you have 2 research projects, or one you can do like in the second semester of this year still, and the other one if you plan it like on the end of the second year, like also second semester, then you have the semester free again, So
I was wondering, is it possible to like basically spend the complete next year in a research project?
yeah, so there
I will
are,
have to take advanced statistics in the first month, but then I'm free each other again.
there are options that you instead of 2 projects that you only do 1 project that is very long. I think it should be about 60 EC then at least. Oh, you can. Oh, but I thought you just want to do 1 project. You can do 2 projects.
So I want to like the next semester I want to do the first one, and the next year, almost the whole year, I want to do the second one.
Well, you can have, I think, up to 90 EC on both internships combined. So you can do like one for 36 right now, and the next year it's 45. So it's almost the entire year. Mine is, of course, advanced statistics. So
Is it so if you do 2 projects, is it big both last half year or should it be longer?
Yes, how was that?
the first one should be 36 EC, and the second one 30 EC. But it really, like also for me, it really depends on what you need for EC. Like for my first project, I needed 37 EC to have 60 EC at the end. And for my second project, I needed 31 EC. And most of the supervisors are very lenient. If you just ask how many hours do I have to spend here to get 31, and they will say like, oh, 3 months or something like that.
That's cool.
Yeah,
I see.
they're quite lenient. So,
Because I like to do my second project at home, like a lot.
yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just only stay in Leiden or in the Netherlands, because she lives in Leiden until next year, end of first semester, and
Yeah.
just move back home.
Exactly.
That would be much cheaper. It's so
I
expensive.
can imagine, yeah.
Like, and I'm sure I'm from Luxembourg, like we're used to like ridiculous rents, but it's just it's crazy. So
I still get my housing. At least
You
I
haven't?
Yeah.
It's really hard, yeah.
I'm crushing a couch. Couch.
Like I literally found a place, and it was suddenly so easy. Like for a month, I wasn't getting replies, and most replies were saying sorry, Dutch only, which really upset me. I was like, yeah, sorry.
No, they usually say no international, so it's not Dutch speaking only, it's no international. Which is not the same.
Yeah, but I got Dutch only a lot. And I was like, okay, am I going to do it? Because I always thought you guys were.
We are very international normally. Like I'm not in student. Well, I was in student housing but a studio, so I didn't have like roommates, you know. But other than that, I don't actually know that. I just said that they were very international, so I'm very saturated. Some student houses are only Dutch. I mean,
A lot of them, most of them, like most of the cheap ones, which would be around like €3, 200 something, they're mostly only Dutch, and there's like 20 people living in a house, so it must be living hell at the same time, but
A lot of them sound like you gotta watch the same series as us, you gotta spend like 2 weeks together.
maybe that also explains why they're so keen on being Dutch, because you have to speak the same language as them. They don't want to like accommodate. I mean, it's very stupid because like for their, or at least most of the studies that we have, you have to speak English the whole day. You will work with international students, even with the work afterwards. You will have to speak English. So exactly, you know.
So I was lucky to learn this play literally 2 days before I was
Oh yeah.
I was so stressed.
Don't
I
you?
know, and I was like, is this really happening? Yeah, months I was just struggling. It was so stressful. That's why I say I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was stressed.
What you can do, like, I think you've heard of Duo, right? So what you can do, or one of my friends, what they did, they were international. So Duo, it gives you priority if you come from very far, if you have very long travel time.
Which is why I couldn't help someone to relate a neighbor.
Yeah.
But
That's
they don't know
exactly
is that
why.
I don't have a home in Luxembourg because I don't live with my parents.
Exactly. So that's why I recommend that most of the people, because they start the master, you know, they have somewhere to crash with friends or something. But they should know that the place that you crash, it isn't a like actual place that you live. Exactly, you're not registered. It is a place where you live. You actually live in London, so your travel time should actually be huge. You know.
yeah. With Retail, I should have been registered for like years to get something.
If you don't come, if you're most of the time first years get priority, the people that come from very far, but if you live close, like I live about 45 minutes away, I had to wait, like if I live now, right now, I would be at the top of the list because I have about 8 years, I think. But if I was back then, like my third year when I started my master, I would still be like 20th in almost every list. So
Oh yeah, I'll wait 10 years.
yeah, but that's why they have the priority. If you come from very far, then of course you really need a place. But yeah, of course, to me they say, well, 45-minute train rides. I mean, it's more doable than someone that has to come from Groningen back all the way, you know. So, but that's why you can also cheat the system. Just tell them honestly, this is just a sleepover. This isn't a permanent residence for me. I don't pay to live here. You know, I need an actual place to live here because I'm gonna get evicted at some point.
Also, the problem is like I've got actually a number of viewings last week or this week. I'm probably going to two. I hope for but like, the problem is still so many people are looking for a place that is like 20 people, like more than 100 people send them messages, like how do they choose that one? They only have one place. It's still very difficult.
I think at least from my experience, my best bet was always duo. And then simply having the priority, of course. If you don't have priority, then you don't bother with it.
I just don't know. I know that says here, like, you have to practice every 5 years for 8 years, but then if I'm not gonna get the priority on your life,
Exactly.
that's like,
Yeah.
I'm still hesitant
That is
to try because I've
strong
already
point.
wrote to Cabernet and it's like money also.
Like,
Yeah.
explain my situation now. It's like fair enough, like priority. But you're assuming that I have a place to stay, which isn't the case.
Which isn't the case.
My
Actually.
Luxembourg by the end of August, and I was so nervous.
Yeah.
Starting again and not having.
I mean, that's why really contact them if that's the case, because they should know that this priority that you have isn't the correct
Yeah,
priority.
they didn't help. Like, none of them. Yeah. I was like, so is there any point? Is there really relying on this website? And they couldn't even say yes or no, but they kind of made it clear that, yeah, good luck,
Yeah, it is really good luck.
And I think that's the overall approach that the university also has. Because there are so many students.
Yeah, I think at some point.
In advance. I'm like, how is that possible? You don't even know.
I
At
got
that
accepted in
point,
July.
yeah.
Like that's why I started to like
Looking already for it.
I've been looking before, but I also know people who started applying. I got a few who were like, yeah, you could come, but you have to be from like June, and I was like, hell no, why the fuck would I do that? I'm gonna go in September.
Yeah.
What you can also do maybe is anti-clerk. Which are basically very old buildings, and people don't want, poor people to inhabit them secretly and break in.
I should be able to do Dutch for them, and
You should be able to speak
yes,
Dutch.
because most of their communication is in Dutch, and I also need someone who has a Dutch bank account, but because of non-Vietnamese, and I don't have that yet. I don't have my own income, so there are so many things wrong with that.
It's also very sad.
I
I know a lot of Dutch people do that because it's very hard for them to find it simply because of the priority. A lot of people they already live in the Netherlands, and if they live close by, they're never getting priority. So if they really need a room, they go on to Prague.
So many.
I mean, it's simply because there are so many students. That's the real problem, yeah. They should. It's very, it's not, yeah. And the government knows because even like this is for student housing, even normal housing is so hard to buy. Yeah. It's, I mean, if you buy a house right now, it will likely inflate in price because I mean it's so hard to find houses. It is a good investment.
Our poor little savings.
I mean, one friend who went together with other friends, or at least their parents, they gave them a loan so they could buy a house together. And then they had two roommates that they also like included, but then those roommates paid rent. And eventually they got really rich of it. They got a lot of money of it. So yeah, eventually it paid back, and for them it was they had a place. So there are ways, but you have to be a little bit sneaky. Like also with Duo, just put in where you're actually from and not the place where you're crashing because it isn't your actual residence. Just temporary, it's like a hotel. Yeah.
It's like frustrating for me and then for them too. None of us have their own places to stay. Makes it really sad. It's being unknown for almost 3 weeks. I am really hoping for something for the first hour. I'm gonna if I can find something. I mean, ask other friends.
Yes, me from one couch to the next, but like it's gonna be very at least possible.
I mean, depending on how what your project will be, it can be like my project. I'm a statistician, so my projects are very easy to model right now. But yeah, some of the biology projects they can be like systems biology or bioinformatics related. I also want to do a lab. Don't worry. Yeah.
So but that's not true because I have to work like 56 hours a month if I want to get that. I'm not eligible for that because I'm not from the Netherlands. No, we have to work 56 hours
Yeah,
to
I
get
think
free
I also
travel.
remember that one. I also had a friend who was from the UK who had to work
So
actually a
there's
few.
no point
For no one,
in
yeah.
applying for this.
Unless you work 56 hours a month, or you have a partner who's Dutch, or you have a parent who's Dutch,
Yeah, I think.
something like this.
I might have to contact my first boyfriend, like, sorry,
Go, can you help me back?
can we get married? Oh god, I would not want that.
What my friend did, she was also in the UK, and I think she didn't do 65 hours a month, and what she did was just in the summer break, she worked a lot to compensate, so she would technically get 65 a month if you like divide it over the
Oh,
year.
for real?
She made she had some kind of thing like that going on. I don't know how she like contacted them and
Hours in total, or a month?
a month I think.
Yeah, but I mean, that's not much actually. That's like 14 hours a week. It would be 1 or 2 days.
And I mean, you also get paid yourself.
Sure,
So
yeah.
you know, it's not like they take the money and you have to pay them to get the. It's like a real job for yourself to get.
No, you need to do it
You
every
need to
month,
get
and you get it only if you've worked 56 hours that month.
Yeah.
So it has to be ongoing.
So I have to work
You have to
for
keep
years.
going. I mean, it's not hard to.
That really sucks.
I know, right?
Like I also, I emailed the municipality so I could like, get a citizen number so I could apply for that. And then the woman just like sent me a link to this Dutch website, so I ended up just booking an appointment for some random thing. I showed up yesterday and then I was everything like, you're here for something else, right?
Yeah, but
Yes,
then they
sorry,
should
but
have
the
put it aside.
website was entirely in Dutch.
Yeah.
I like asked my flatmate, like my housemate, to help and tried to figure something out. And Jesus is the best thing.
Okay, it's just a church. These are the like criteria. What of these apply? Yeah.
It's
Yeah, also the Dutch. My Dutch friends were really this is like, oh, you can buy this and then travel industry. I'm like, yeah, that's so cool. I told my parents, my brother also lived here, and then he looked this up and like, sorry, but no.
There's always
So,
It's super expensive. It's like honestly.
Yes, I've also like for students here you only have it for 5 years. Yeah, so you have 3 years. Normally it's 3 years bachelor and 2 years master, but I did 2 masters, so you know I have an extension. But because of that, I already lost it after my first master, and for me it's going back and forth. It's about 16 euros without the bus cost. 16 a day basically.
It's 12 per
Yeah. So I have 40% off, like a discount. So for me, I mean that's a little bit better, but I mean it's still about 10 euros a day.
What about the seasonal
No, the only thing that I think is worth it is the discount.
5 years one. The peak
Um, I would do a calculation of yourself, like think how much you're gonna travel because there are two ones. There's one for 5 euros, which is 40% off between if you travel between 9 o'clock and 4 o'clock. But I mean, like for now, for me it wouldn't work because I have to eight, so I have to travel already early before 9. So then I would have to pay full price, and after I get home in the afternoon, then I would have a discount. You also have one for 23 euros, and that is a 20% discount outside of 9 and 4, and like 40% discount inside 9 and 4.
Oh, that's very nice.
Yeah, that's at least also in the mornings. If you have to travel, you also have the discount.
I found one where
Yeah.
should be able to like I should be able to travel every and
Yeah.
back
Yeah.
without having to pay extra, and then I get discounts like if I go to different places, but like on a fixed route.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I think that one
That one will also work, yeah. For me, of course, it's flexible because I don't have to travel every day. But yeah, if you have to, you guys likely have to travel every day. So that one is actually very
Because
good.
otherwise it's always like,
Yeah.
Go with a bike. Bike everywhere.
I thought I
That's
wasn't
very
gonna
Dutch.
buy. I thought I wasn't gonna buy because I didn't really like biking, but oh my god, it's so much easier.
You can also, I mean, you can always get a scooter as well or something like that.
So much rent that nearly 800 euros.
Also, the problem for me, like my maximum, I don't have maximum budget is 600, but it's also a lot. So I would prefer
I mean, it's not an unreasonable budget. I mean, if you look at the price at Duo, that should be a normal house price. But what happens is, there's a lot of demand. So
and like private landlords.
private landlords are gonna,
I
oh,
wanted to sell a studio, which was just a bathroom. Let's not even talk about that yet. For 700 euros.
This woman would like rent out this tiny room. It didn't even have a bed, like it was a sofa bed, and it was really like a tiny house within a house, and like for like 800 euros.
And it was private.
And she was like, we don't have a desk in your room, so like if you need to study, you can use the kitchen table, and I'll just send the other girl who's renting the room upstairs. I'll just send her upstairs to her. That is not gonna
but
work.
she is gonna tell the other one also the same thing. So
Probably like, it was ridiculous. I'm happy I said no to that because I didn't want to pay so much. But
yeah.
this house is actually really nice and international, so it's nice, but it is quite expensive. And I'm not
It
sure.
is.
I'm sure I can make it this year because I've been working, but I don't know if I can pay for it. And I guess I won't get any like help from my rent because I don't work.
Well, if you find a studio, you can get housing allowance.
Yeah, I don't get it if I'm just renting a room.
No, not for a room, that's for a studio. So like own door, own bathroom, and kitchen. For that you get a housing allowance.
What you can also do is if you do your second internship, if you do that at a company, most companies they offer pay like that. Yeah.
In the Netherlands or
In the
everywhere?
Is it a
At least in the Netherlands, I
is
don't
it a
know.
decent?
I think a friend of mine, she got about 600 euros a month. I mean, it's for an internship, you still have to learn,
And it's
but
not unpaid, like unpaid job, right? But they get
I mean, for them, you're basically a cheap worker. Like if they have to,
even if they only have to pay like 600 euros,
This is
because we
not
don't have to pay
yeah, of course,
cash.
They would
for
have
you it's a lot of money, but for them, like a whole new person who has actually graduated, unlike
That would
you,
be like
it will be like 2,000 euros exactly. For them, it's a lot cheaper.
internships.
And the advantage also for them is if you like it and you like to work there,
Stay
then
there.
you can stay there. I know a lot of people who actually worked at a company and they stay there because they really like it. Hardest part, of course, is finding a company.
That's what I wanted.
That's
No,
always.
I mean, what I
but-
wanted to say is it's very nice that they offer help with housing fee, but
Yeah.
which is the problem.
That's always the major problem.
That's why I'm thinking about doing the second internship abroad.
Yeah, I hope that they should pay you a month's salary as well.
Yeah. I wouldn't blame you to do the second internship abroad.
I don't think they pay you in Portugal
For what?
for an internship.
I mean, even some companies don't
I
pay
mean,
you.
it
It's really,
depends on the
it
company.
depends.
If you work for like an American company, they're British probably. I'm sure that. But Portugal, all my parents are Portuguese, so I'm always down in Portugal. But thank you though for like sharing your knowledge.
My experiences, don't worry.
I think like even you as like a Dutch citizen, you kind of struggled, but then
Then even,
all
yeah.
of them say this, like I hear this from
It's also the Dutch people, yeah. I mean, like the Netherlands is very nice, and I think you will also like the master a lot, at least from what I've already seen from you. But yeah, it's really hard. There's such a small country. So, you know, you put a lot of people in there.
You're speaking to a Luxembourger, like.
Oh, yeah. That's
This
even-
is huge. This is massive.
But at least you have free public transport.
Dude, honestly,
Yeah.
yeah. No, like it was like for a day ticket, it was €4. You could use
So much
train
better.
and bus from Luxembourg. So now when I look at the prices here, I'm like,
Okay, let me go first. In Hungary, like a student monthly ticket costs
yeah.
for the whole month, and you can choose whichever, whenever.
Yeah.
There are even like buses and trains during the night. It makes it like another city.
Budapest is really well.
So much better. Yeah.
But yeah, I thought I was gonna like the Netherlands more than Luxembourg, but I realized you get at least the same you get in Luxembourg because in Luxembourg you get a lot of help as well.
Yeah.
But from here it's just so much more difficult.
To get yeah.
Any kind of help. And maybe it's because I'm a citizen of Luxembourg, so I like automatically.
I mean, even if you're Dutch, I found it also hard to find help. Like, if I have a question, for instance, I have, because I was finishing up the first master and I want to start the second master, you know, I have to sort it out with my labs, you know. And to sort that out, I had to wait, I think, 1.5 hours behind the line to call someone and to finally get someone. And I mean, it was like awful. I was like, I think redirected 3 times to like a central point that said you're waiting very long or you're still there, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's really even for Dutch students. So yeah, don't. But I think even for you, you have these problems. But being an international student
Let's not speak of
who's not speaking Dutch, you know, at least we understand most of the things that they say, and then we still have to call them. But you also have to call them because you don't have maybe some resources in Dutch. So yeah, I understand the struggle very well.
It's frustrating.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'll see how I feel after 2 years, but that increase, like I used to always run away from home, like whenever I could, I would leave home, like I lived in Scotland and lived in Greece, and I was like, I will never settle in Luxembourg, and now I'm like in Greece. I like the idea of being in Luxembourg. At least you know
I
how things
mean,
work.
if you like doing a PhD here is actually very good because most countries, I don't know how it's in Luxembourg, but I know from the UK. In the UK, you're still treated as a student and you have to pay tuition. And the only money that you get is if you have funding. And most of the time, you also have to sort it out yourself. Yeah. But here, you're actually paid employee. As you're just exactly you're a researcher, you're just a paid employee, and that's also you do research and you have some course on the side, you know, still as a PhD student you're still learning something, but they treat you as a that's very nice. I think especially if you've done the master at some point you desire some kind of professionalism.
You want to start having money,
Exactly.
you know?
oh, in Hungary,
Yeah.
they're kind of like an employee, but not really, because they get paid around probably a bit less.
Oh.
It's hard, like you cannot pay rent. You're like, you're no one. Like, where should these people live? Under a bridge.
Excuse me, we have so many beautiful bridges. Under the bridge, you mean?
No, it's just
And 2 years will pass really fast. I hope we like meet like in 2 years again. We can have a similar conversation. You will have found your way. I will figure it. Like I will figure things out.
I want to renew the second month, and I hope I'll find a place by then.
I think at least like last year I also heard a lot of international students like complain, but those international students they're doing advanced statistics right now. So maybe if you also likely see them still with courses, you know, and you can ask them how they solve. They likely notice or like the people that right now if they're international and they're doing advanced statistics, they likely need to pay statistics also. Because I mean just like you don't really know whether you're really good at statistics, you're from outside Leiden, you know, you don't know one bit yet. But many of the internationals they also have this course for that reason. But they're likely still doing calls. So if you see them around, just ask if that has to go. Because I know many of them also struggle. It's older people, they're like,
Yeah, it's gonna be like education and stuff like for everything, but like also this last few days the ads are getting fewer and fewer. It's like 3 or 4 or 5 new places every day. It's maybe one every day or less. And still are hard to pick. So good.
at least the trick applications that I know are at least like if you go there, just look up if you can already see who they are. Like just on LinkedIn and talk about their interest as a, or your interest. Like the Facebook and such. And if you see like some of the persons if they have I don't know an interest in cars or something, just shout, oh, I have a very old car interest or something.
Wearing
You know?
t-shirts saying I love cars.
Because in the end they want someone that has a connection with them. So you know they're
You can see how the connection. It's not gonna happen in 5 minutes during an interview. Like,
course
what are
not.
they waiting for?
I still like more biased. Making sure to say this first and like
I have to like cars. I get it. All right.
I mean just in advance. And I mean even if you don't get accepted, a lot of people just go there simply because you get food. You get sometimes beer, you get sometimes food if you're invited. So you haven't gotten anything yet. It's normally usual.
The interviews.
Maybe they had too many people that already ate all the chips and ate all the, drank all the beer.
I got a glass of food. I'm going to another today.
Do you guys do au pairs here? Like, is it common to have
In Arnhout, it's very common. Arnhout is sort of the, how do you say it? Oh, and Lisse, you also have het Gooi. Yeah. There it's very common to have au pairs. This is actually very common. They have, it's called het Gooi. I don't know if there's an English equivalent, but it's basically where all the rich people, like very rich people live. And they all want au pair.
Are you paid as an au pair or you just get accommodation as well?
Depends. Most of the time you get a place to live and you get paid a little bit for your own, like if you're able to do your own groceries and such and be able to live, you know. But other than that, because they already pay your rent and such, you don't get like the full price. That's why.
There was a room which I applied, and 3 of them, like the other day. So they said, okay, it's a free room. We also have an au pair. You should be. We just ask in return of your room. We just ask you to help us with the chores and sometimes cooking, sometimes babysitting. It's like what?
No, if you get it with that.
I tried to arrange a meeting or something, but like they kind of never replied. So I'm like, alright, okay, that's fine.
Maybe because that was like
Yeah, I wanted to it was like temporary. I was just like registering as the house. Me too, actually.
No, it's still 15 minutes till we start, so.
It's better
Take
not
your
let
time.
start without connected.
Don't worry, I won't start.
We like cars.
Exactly. Uh, Wel, dat kan ik weten. Ja, altijd een beetje ophouden. Ja, eerst rekenen we altijd een beetje. Een beetje alles gemaakt. Dus dat is niet zo weet. We hebben wel eens mensen gehad die dan even ze waarschuwen voor de toestand. Ja, als het valt. Ja, weer doen. Bezig. You guys have yeah. One of the exercises was
Yeah, it was
exactly.
we were not sure.
I mean, if you have questions after the lecture, I will also talk. It's about the p-value distribution, right? P-value. I will also talk about, well, in light of the chi-square distribution. So maybe if things don't clear from you, just let me know. Yeah. Awesome. Everything went well with the exercises. That was fine. The answer fully closed. Yeah, we always wait a few days so people have to like a chance to really challenge themselves and don't do anything with the exercise now. But yeah, we will eventually always post it because yeah.
Countless, videos and movies. I feel like I'm making fun of them. We haven't done first.
So I will tell him that if he downloads his files into a Word file because he literally copies his files into the formulas. They have a lot of question marks.
No, that's German, you said.
Well, it's actually there. But you can write it down for now, just so you know what it is. Oh, it's also there. Okay. Good. I think you have to know.
And also speak those and also languages,
It's more like show us what's going on. It's also like intuition, you know, you can say like say of intuition and how much you like. The main I would we actually park. We have a college
change. I don't know.
Second part, we can you have to interpret it and also make sure all the if there's no you also the last part is the last part is really sort of the hard one. You also go through the schools, really hard. They should have to connect things to each other.
Which is so crazy. Like,
Otherwise, you can also
English classes and like they're meant to play. They don't want to sit still for an hour and 9 hours. What the fuck? And this is like systematic.
if there aren't multiple like
I really wanted to help. I don't want to. It's a good point though.
after everything.
I haven't thought about it that way yet.
But I mean, if you're doing this for years, I know it's like so stereotypical, like I used to do it as now
If you smile, I was a tiny babies when they're like you heard it. You heard it.
my 2-year-old.
What's your
Sono sconosciuta, un mese quando sono iscritto, quel mese penso che arriverà fra una settimana, devo pagare. Sì, in periodo di registrazione ce la vogliono almeno che siano lavoratori, che comunque abbiano un reddito.
Don't have to care about it anymore.
Ja, je kan hier nog steeds nog blijven.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm used to it, you know. What should I choose?
Sorry, what's your name?
Patrick.
Patrick. The help job.
Sorry?
The help job, which one do I need to click?
This one. So you can type in your code here, or you can also, what you can do is a question mark, and then the function. And then at the bottom of this, you have all these arguments, which can be a little bit hard to understand, but you have examples at the bottom, and they mostly explain what they do. So, and as you can see, a lot of the functions or arguments that you have, you don't have to use them. So they're like basic settings. And if you really want something, then you can change it. As you can see, with the example, most of the things looks a lot more simple. You're welcome. Set up the.
I know, I'm trying to save you. Yeah, I have. Yeah. Those things now. Yeah, exactly.
Where's the sixth line?
I think it's exciting. Yeah.
Shall we all get started? Guys, can we start? Yes. Okay. So today you will see a new face, which is me, Patrick. I think some of you may know me from the first introduction. I may have helped you with exercise already. So I actually gave this course last year, and this year Frans has basically revamped it and made it his own. So because Frans couldn't give his lecture today, I will give a lecture about chi-square tests. And basically, if you have any questions in between, just let me know. Yeah. So today, what I want to go over with you is basically, I want you guys to be able to identify a scenario. So you can still join if you, oh, not here, I guess. So I want you guys to be able to distinguish when you use a chi-square test. So, you know, think about assumptions, just like a t-test, that something has to be normal distributed. Chi-square test also has a specific scenario and specific assumption when you should use it, and I want you to be able to identify that. Then I also want you to be able to calculate the expected value. You will learn about what that is later. I want you to be able to determine the degrees of freedom of your chi-square test. And lastly, I also, of course, want you to be able to calculate a chi-square statistic. Then, if you have that, if you have a chi-square statistic, I want you to be able to relate it to the chi-square distribution. So if I have a certain chi-square value, what does that mean when you go towards the p-value with those probability distributions that you learned? After that, we will also talk about contingency tables. I don't know if you've seen them before or familiar. If you haven't, I will show you an example. But the chi-square test is actually a perfect test for contingency tables. And we will also go over what they are and why you use a chi-square test and how, of course. Important with that is I also want you guys to be able to describe what dependency is in a contingency table. So I want you to be able to calculate them with the chi-square statistic, but I also want you to be able to see if I give you a dependency table, even without the test, if you're able to see if there's so-called what we call dependency. Yeah? And lastly, I will also explain you why we use so-called Yates contingency correction. Yeah? It is basically, it is the standard test that we use, the chi-square test with the contingency correction, but I also want you to understand why we actually do that. You don't have to calculate it, just understand why. Yeah? So the chi-square test, basically what we do is we want to compare observed versus expected frequency. So, for instance, with plants, I expect a certain amount of plants to bloom, and I then measure how many plants I actually see bloom. I will have examples for that later. Basically, the trend with this is that most of the time you work with count data. At count data, as you may have learned during the past lectures already, it isn't normally distributed. You can't really use t-tests on that to see differences. And sometimes it's also quite hard to work with that because you have certain classifications going on. And that I will also have examples of that. So what we want to do with the chi-square test is, as I've said, we mainly want to compare the observed amount that we see towards expected amount. Yeah, that's really the trend that you will see. And basically the chi-square test, it looks like this. We call it also the Pearson's chi-square test. It is the most common one. You have variations, but this is really the one when we talk about the chi-square test. And what we do in this case is we compare the amount of observed so we have X plants that we observed that have bloomed, towards the expected amount. So based on maybe literature or based on what you think would happen, so if you think equal amount of plants will have bloomed, you will have an idea of how many plants you have expected, and that is basically what you want to know. And as you can see, you want to take the difference and square it. The square is simply to make it positive. So it doesn't matter whether it differs positively or differs negatively. We just want to know, is there a difference between observed and expected? Yeah? I hope you are all familiar with the notation, with those I's and the K's. You've seen it before? You understand it? Not yet, I see some afraid faces. So basically what those I's mean is for each, I want to of course show it here, but for each of the groups that we have, so let's say I have 3 plant species that I measure. For each of the plant species I want to see how many I have observed. How many plants do I actually have that have bloomed for each of those species. And then I want, if I expect that equal amounts of plants have bloomed, I want to subtract the expected number of plants. And I do this for each of those groups. Then I square it, and then I divide it again by the expected amount. There's no real logic behind that, but it is at least there. And basically, if I have multiple groups, I sum up in the end, I sum them all up. So I have a kind of a total error, and that's what the chi-square test is all about. How much does my observed differ from the expected? I think I've said it a lot of times by now, but can't say it enough. And that's also what the chi-square statistic reflects in the end. The larger the chi-square statistic, the more there is deviation from between observed and expected. Yeah? That's all there is to it. So it's kind of a total error. Lastly, the degrees of freedom that you're kind of familiar with, I hope. Basically, the degrees of freedom is the number of groups that you have. So let's say I have 3 plant species, minus 1 is 2 in that case. So it's the number of groups minus 1. I can't make it easier than that. I'm not going to go in detail as to why, you just have to know it is k minus 1. Yes? So, as an example, and also a good example as to why we want to use the chi-square test, because I wouldn't know how to apply a t-test to this. So let's say we roll a die, and a die, it can only take 6 values. So basically you have what we call a qualitative outcome. It can be in this group, this group, and this group, or this group. Like 1, can be 2, 4. That's really hard to do with a t-test. Or at least I wouldn't know how to do it with a t-test, because most of the time you just compare 2 groups. What we can do is, if we want to know if there is a fair roll of the die, we just roll it a few times and then calculate how many times it faces a certain way. So how many times do I get 1, how many times do I get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If the die is fair, then we would have, or we would expect that each of these sides have an equal chance to come up, right? I think we're all familiar with the sort of mathematics behind the die. Each of the sides has a 1/6 chance, or each of the sides has a 1/6 chance to come up. And basically, based on that, if we roll a die 60 times, we would expect that each side would turn up in total 10 times, right? Simply the frequency that we expect times the total number of draws that we have. Yeah? 10 sides. Well, then how do I calculate the chi-square statistic? Simply the expected values that we have here. So the first one is 1, the second one is 2, and we all subtract them from 10. So far, so clear? Yeah, right? All there is to it, and in the end, as you can see, you do it separately for each of these groups, and then you sum them up. And then you get some kind of a total deviation. How many error do I have left? How many difference do I have from the expected? Based on that, we can go back to our probability distribution. So we have a test statistic, the chi-square statistic, and we want to know if there is significant deviation from observed and expected. Because we know nature is random, there will always be I don't know, there will be sometimes that you have 11 times up and sometimes there's 9 times up, but you expect 10. Where are you going to draw the line that you say this is really a significant difference between observed and expected? And that's why we use the chi-square distribution. And as I said before, the chi-square test, those statistics, it can only be positive. Yeah? And very logical with this distribution, or at least to mine, the larger your value is, the larger your chi-square test, the lower your p-value, right? If you remember from the t-test, this whole distribution, this area under the curve, it represents your p-value. So this whole distribution, it represents 1. And the further you go, the higher your test statistic, the smaller the area under the curve. So you will actually move from side to side. And I think here is also a good example with the 4 that we had right now from the rolling the dice. As you can see, at 4 we see that it shifts a little bit, and we calculate specifically the area under the curve, so the chance that it will be by random that we would find it. Clear? Okay. Well, and then basically for this example, you should remember, if the dice fair based on this probability distribution that we have a 45% chance that it is by coincidence. And lastly, that is too important. Then we move on to another example, because I mean this is rolling dice, basically like tossing coins. That's also always the basic example. If we're biologists, we don't roll dice, we work with living creatures. So here are the plants that I mentioned before. So let's say we have 3 flower species. And this is also a good example where you don't have that all the groups have the same chance of occurrence. As you can see here, we have 3 plant species. The first one, the roses, they actually have a higher chance of occurrence. So as you can see, they occur with a half. The other 2 only with a quarter, and in total is of course 1. We measure the amounts of plants that we have, so what we actually observe, and then we go back to the expected value. So how do we calculate the expected value in this case? We want to know how many plants, based on how many seeds I've sown, how many plants would have bloomed. And we can find that out by simply using those proportions, right? We know that if I have a total of, let's say, I have to calculate this, if I have a total of 50 plants in total, then I would expect half of them to be roses, and part of them to be, I don't know what the other ones were, it's not saying it, but let's say daisies, and the last one I expect to be, the last quarter to be sunflowers. And the same way you can split it up. So what you do is you multiply each of these proportions with the total amount of flowers that you have, total amounts of seeds that you have sown basically. And sometimes the total amount that you have, you can extract it from the observed, right? You have a total amount of observed, and you want to know the proportions, what they should have been in the total amount of observed, as you can see here. Yes, and based on that, we have the expected, and just like before, we subtract each observed from the expected value, square it, divided by the expected value. And then if we have multiple groups, we do it separately for all the groups, as you can see here, and we sum them up. Clear? Yes, that's good. Well, out of that we have another chi-square value, and this chi-square value is the same ID. So before that, before the chi-square distribution, we still have to determine the amount of degrees of freedom that we have. We had 3 groups in total in this case, so 3 minus 1 is 2. That's basically the degrees of freedom for your chi distribution. And as you can see, it shifted a little bit. So you have less groups and it tends to shift forward, but that's not very important for you to remember, just that it will shift if you have a different degrees of freedom. Well, based on that, we can also find the area on the curve again. So as you can see, 6, it is a lot further than 4. So we expect that the p-value will be actually lower, right? The chance that it will be by chance. You can also see it, the area will be a lot smaller. And as you can see here, the p-value, it is actually significant. It is below 0.05. And basically what that means, just to refer to the last one, it means that we have a 4.7% chance that this is by chance that we have this finding, that we think that there is a difference. Yeah? Oh, hey.
Morning.
So what do we say then in the end? There is a significant difference between the amount that we expected and the amount that we have observed. And what does that relate to the research question? Well, we would expect that the proportions would be a certain way. But in truth, they differ significantly from these proportions, right? We had an idea we would have half the roses, a quarter daisies, and a quarter sunflowers, but that's not the case in the end. So we know that there's a significant difference between those proportions. And based on that, we might have to reevaluate what the actual proportions are, or if you can actually model this with those proportions. That's basically it, all for the chi-square test, or at least how it works. Then we go on to the assumptions. And honestly, the chi-square test, it doesn't really have any assumptions, or at least not very important ones. It's more of a recommendation. So what we most of the time recommend is that you have at least 5 observations. Just so you know you have, how do you say it, each of the groups is well represented. As chi-square test, it doesn't really work if you have an expected value of 0, because then you divide by 0. Yeah, so you need at least to have some kind of starter, an expectation how many times something will occur. And secondly, and this is also a little bit more important, is that the test statistic should be chi-square distributed. In those cases, like that you see right now, it is. Like when you work with counts, it's almost always chi-square distributed, but it has more to do with the Yates continuity correction that we actually come back to in the end. So the most important one when you directly work with a chi-square test is that assumption that the expected count shouldn't be too low, but also remember it should be chi-square distributed, but that's more like a t-test, a t-value should also be t-distributed. It makes sense. It should follow the distribution. But there's a reason why we explicitly say it here, and I will show that. Also a little bit of R code. Also maybe helps how you do this in R. So with the other example, I think this is the example. No, it is not the example of the dice. So I think this is the example, a new example, where we have drawn 4 numbers. If each of those numbers has an equal chance of occurrence, it would basically all be 5, right? It would just be the average value. So basically you also have kind of the, I think that's what you want to show, is you have kind of the idea of a t-test where you also have a certain difference with the average ones. Although it is a very good example. Okay, now the nice part, because those flowers, I mean, most of the time what we do is we want to expose flowers and we want then to measure something. You know, we don't have any expectations on what flowers do just by themselves. So we want to introduce an exposure. And that's where we come in with contingency tables. So what contingency tables simply are is we basically, if we sample, let's say men and women, and we want to know if there's any effect of smoking on men and women, whether women are more likely to smoke than men, or maybe if smokers are more likely to be female, that can also be. We basically want to calculate, or basically we want to sum up the amount of people that we have for each of these groups, right? And that's basically the simple idea of a contingency table. It's just a summary of how many observations do I have for each of these combinations. So I have 68 men that are smoking and 41 men that are non-smoking. Basically a summary. But then, if I want to answer this question, does smoking and sex have any relation with each other, any correlation with each other? How do I do that with a t-test? Well, I'm here simply because you can't. But we can use the chi-square test, right? Because if it doesn't have any effect, smoking, then we would expect that if I have, let's say, 100 people, then each of these categories, each of these combinations have an equal chance of occurrence, right? If I have 100 people, I would expect that I have 25 men that don't smoke, 25 men that smoke, 25 women that smoke, and 25 women that do not smoke. Everything has an equal chance. But of course, if there is a deviation, men tend to smoke more, then we would see a deviation from that. We would see, instead of 25, we would suddenly see 50 men that smoke. And then, of course, on the opposite side, the amount of non-smoking men would also go down, right? Because you have a limited amount of people. How then do we come to our expected value? Because right now we have this table, but in practice, this table isn't very balanced. So sometimes you have, in general, you have a little bit people that smoke more, sampled people that smoke more, and sometimes you have a little bit more men sampled in your study. So even if you have that, even if you don't have equal amounts of any group, you should be able to calculate the expected value. And you can get to that by simply calculating the marginal sum. So the marginal sum is basically the sum of a certain group, disregardless of any other variable. So you can see just for the group smoking by itself, regardless which sex they are in, I have a total of 150 observations. And for the non-smoking group, I have only half. That also makes it very hard to see if there's something going on, right? Because you don't really have equal amount of smokers to non-smokers. Same you can do with the sex. You can calculate the amount of men that you have, calculate the amount of women. That is a lot more balanced, you can see, but still not. How do I then get to the expected value? I can go on about how philosophical it is, but you can simply multiply the two marginal values and divide by the total number of observations. So if I want to know the expected frequency of men that smoke, I multiply 119, the amount of men, I multiply that with the amount of people that smoke, and I divide it by the total number of people in the group. That's all there is to it. Clear? You will be able to calculate this yourself? Yes? Okay, that's very nice. Basically, I have 4 groups in total, and I want to know, I have a certain expectation now, right? We calculated expectation per group, how many should I see? Even though this is unbalanced design, you have a difference between groups. Then we can simply, just like before, subtract it from the amount that I actually observe, and then we have a chi-square statistic. If you still square it and divide it by the expected value, of course, but I think you know it. And then you sum up all these groups and you know how much total deviation do I have between expected and observed. Important here is the degrees of freedom. Last, like in the other examples, we only had one exposure. We only had type of flower, or we only had a dye value, for instance. Here we actually have 2 separate exposure, or like you know from R, you will then have 2 separate variables, right? So you have sex, and you will have, in this case, you will have smoking versus non-smoking. For each of the variables, last time it didn't really matter because we only have one, but what I said about subtracting the amount of group and then subtracting one from it, we have to do that for each of the covariates separately, for each of these variables. So we have to do it for smoking, non-smoking, and we have to do it for sex. And then simply, if you have multiple ones like this, you multiply at the end. So I had 2 groups, smoking and non-smoking, in one variable, -1, and I had 2 sexes, males and female, -1, and then I multiply it, and that's my degrees of freedom if I have multiple variables. Yeah? Well, based on that, we have our chi-square distribution again. We had a chi-square value of 1.36, and we can see if we put it in, we don't have a significant difference. Males or females do not significantly smoke more or males do not significantly smoke more than females. But you can also say it the other way around still, right? You can also say if high smokers, they're significantly less likely to be females. So you can still turn it around. Which one do you choose if you turn it around? That depends on your research question, right? Did I sample males and females simply because I want to know if they smoke or not? Is that my measurement first exposure first observed? Or is the other way around, did I actually sample smokers and non-smokers to see which sex they were? I think most of the time you sample males and females, but that's all there is to it. But at least with the chi-square statistic. So one important thing, the chi-square test, it is what we call a test of independence. We want to know, or we want to show that having a certain frequency in one variable also shows up if we look at another group of a variable. So we don't want to see any, how do you say it, any frequencies that sort of deviate from this. Like one of the groups, smoking and non-smoking, has a very high frequency of men, and the other group has a very high frequency of women, but a low frequency of men. Yeah? That's what we call dependency. And if it's independent, then all the groups have roughly the same amount of expected first observed. Okay. Sometimes we have a p-value, but we don't really understand why we see it, because as I said, in practice the design is often unbalanced. I don't have exactly 100 people where 50 people smoke and 50 people do not smoke, and 50 men and 50 women. I don't have that in practice. So sometimes it can be hard to see if you have a p-value, if there is actually something significant going on, and which direction. So that's why I illustrated here. I have here 4 contingency tables, and I want you guys to ask or to answer me which of these, just as a simple balanced design still, which of these are significant, or do you think have a significant dependency? I'll let you just look at it for a moment. I will go one by one. And this one can be a little bit tricky, but that's also why I showed it. And especially, of course, in practice, it will be quite tricky when you have unbalanced values. These are still like only 50 and 25.
And the fourth one, so the bottom right one.
Is that the only one?
It's the only one I've detected.
That's good. That's exactly the answer.
Okay.
I was just challenging you. I saw already a confused look. Oh wait, it's not the only one. It is the only one. And why? It is exactly as I said. We see a shift in the frequency in that one, right? In smoking, I see a lot more men, and in non-smoking, I see a lot more women. So there is a sort of what you call an interaction going on, right? We specifically see only in this group that it goes up, whereas if I look at another group from the same variable, I see a lot of another group, a lot of men in non-smoking. Why do I not see it in the other ones? Well, the first one is kind of obvious, right? You have everything occurs at the same rate. But why do I not see it in this one? For instance, in men and women, it's simply because the amount of smoking men is equal to the amount of smoking women if I look at the frequencies of them, right? I just have a lot more men than women. And that's a very easy way to see it, at least in this table. If I see that these are obviously the same in just one row, if they have roughly the same values and also roughly the same values in another column, then I know there's nothing going on. I just have a lot more men than women. The same go if I had a lot more smokers than non-smokers. I can see, okay, I have a lot more smoking than non-smoking, but the proportions between males and females, they're still the same, right? I have the same amount of males that smoke as females that smoke. And the last one, that's where you actually see what we call the dependency. We see that for smoking, we see a lot more men do it, and for non-smoking, we see that a lot more female do it. So you have actually differing frequencies. This is kind of straightforward because it's really the opposite what happens, right? More men smoke and less females smoke. But sometimes you also have that simply put, you still have the same like 25 and 50 for men. But sometimes it's hard to see that the frequency of smokers for females is higher. It's just a lot higher. So let's say you have 25 to 80. It is still like that you think maybe you just have a lot more women, and that's the case. But in that case, it is simply that you also have an effect, right? The proportion of females that smoke is a lot higher than men in that case. And that's what you should be looking out at, not just a contingency table. Oh, I see that this value differs from this one. Yeah. And be able to describe that. I did a little bit too much, I think, but at least describe if you have a certain p-value or certain chi-square statistic. Do you actually see it? Where's the dependency? Do females smoke more than males? Just answer that. Lastly, in R, That's the only thing that's left. How do I do this in R? Because now you know how to do it by hand. But of course, you will never in your research do this by hand, right? You will use R, and that's we know. Not many statistics courses know actually. So how do we basically do that? We have a simple function called chi-test, and that's it. Of course, I'm going to explain how to do this function. Otherwise, it wouldn't make so much sense. So with I think the first examples, we only had one row with expected and observed, right? And we had those frequencies still. So this is the die example still. So we had 5 ones, 2 of 13 twos, 9 threes, and so forth. And we expected that each of these had a 1.1 divided by 6 chance to occur, right? And if you remember from the code, this, just as an explanation, this code is repeat. So what this code basically does, it makes a string just like above, but puts in 1 divided by 6 times. Yeah, maybe also I can draw it, but people online can't see it. That's the unfortunate part. So basically what you do is 1 divided by 6, 1 divided by 6. That's what you do with a repeat function. It says 1 divided by 6, I want to repeat it 6 times. And you get this. Yeah, that's all there is. Sometimes code look very hard and you don't know. It's only 5 times I see, but just remember the 6 times. So basically, we have a number of observed values. We have the probability that each of these values should occur. Right? If I have a total of 60 rolls, each of these values should be 1/6 of 60, so it should be 10. They calculate it automatically for you if you just give in the frequencies. And that's also why the order is important. So if you don't have, like here, everything is 1/6, that's fine. But especially with the flower example below, as you can see, the first one, the roses, it had a 1 to 2 chance to occur. So then, of course, you should line them up. That's the only thing that you have to make sure with that. And that's it. You have the rolls, the observed values, you throw them in. And you have P, the probability that each of these values would occur. Of each of these, if you have a total number, what's the percentage that you would expect? Yeah? And that's chi-square test, and then you put it in, and you get a chi-square value out of it. So far clear also how to do this in R? Well, the example that I showed you just now isn't, of course, very relatable, because we don't often just look at flowers by themselves, but we have, of course, these contingency tables that we really use in practice. And that's also quite simple. There you don't even have to calculate the proportions, it does it for you, because it expects this test, as I said before, it expects that each of these cells have an equal chance of occurrence. So they should be all 1/4. It will remember that. If you have a larger design, it will basically also adapt to that. So then if you have a total of 8 cells, it will be all 1/8, right? If you have to change that for whatever reason, and it should be normal that one of the cells has a higher occurrence, then you might want to use the P again. But any test that I've seen so far has the chance that everything should equally occur. So normally you only have to make a matrix, as shown here, and you put in the matrix contingency table, and you will also get a chi-square statistic. Yeah. The matrix by itself, Frans has nicely shown this actually. I also code it like this. So you put in the order. What are the smoking versus non-smoking? Each has a 1/4 chance of occurrence with this table, so it doesn't really matter what the order are in this case. But still, it's nice for you to show, like, for your own, what were the values you have maybe in your lab journal written what the actual values were. So if you just line them up like this, then you know what they are. And maybe also important for that is the by row part. So by row is true, because then it will first, if I have two columns, then it will fill them by the row. So the first two values will be the first row, and the second two values will be the second row. I think that's very intuitive for you to do. If I have three columns, then the first three values will be like the first row, and the second three values will be the second row. Yeah. Most of the time, contingency tables they're just as you can see 2 on 2. But if you have multiple groups, then you can also adapt it like that. Then, lastly, the contingency correction or continuity correction. Why do we do this correction, or why do we read about this correction? Well, the thing as you've seen is we work with counts, and counts they can only be whole numbers, right? But, and I've neatly hidden that, in practice, if we calculate the expected values, we often don't get whole numbers. We get like, I don't know, 36.5. And then we round it up, as we've shown to you. But that's the problem with the chi-square test. These expected values, they can't be whole, so you always have a certain amount of error, right? Because you can't have whole values as expected values, or they can differ from whole values, that's the better way to say it. So you always have some kind of error. If I have an expected value of 13.5, then of course it will differ with 0.5, so I will have a difference between observed and expected. So my chi-square test, it will be too strict, because I will have a lot more error than I'm supposed to have, right? Because of the expected values being able to not be whole numbers, to differ like that. So that's why we have the J's continuity correction. It's basically add a little bit more leniency, so that even though we are able to get non-integer expected values, it doesn't affect in a bad way your chi-square test. Yeah. So it's basically a correction for that. As also shown here, only with text, unfortunately. And how do you don't have to well, you can remember that, but it's not really of importance. I really focus more that you understand the whole observed versus expected. But how does he do that? You first, just like before, calculate the difference between observed and expected, and then you take the absolute value. So if it was negative, it will just be positive. Everything will be positive. That's what you do with absolute values. And after that, you subtract 0.5. I can go on by 0.5, on why the philosophy is behind this. It has to do with the way things round. So you round at 0.5. So sometimes 0.5 you round up, and sometimes 0.5 you round down. So on average, these expected values from true values, they will differ with 0.5. That's the idea. You don't have to remember why we exactly use 0.5, but just remember why we do it. Why we do this whole correction is simply because those expected values, they can't be whole numbers. And then we have always a small difference between expected and observed. That's why we do it. After that, it's business as usual. You just square it and divide it by the expected value. And if you have multiple groups, you sum this separately for each of the groups. If, so in R, the chi-square test, that's, what's the function called? Just and then dot test. It will always use that correction, because it will always expect, if it calculates its expected values, that it will correct. But some of the cases, quite rare cases, you have a certain expectation. So you have already, I know I should get 5, or I know I should get 10. It isn't a, how do you say it? It won't be a decimal. Very rare cases, but at least so you know what to do then, is you can also get what we call the exact chi-square test. Then you don't have this leniency correction. Then it will actually give you, based on the formula that you saw before, right? Just observed minus expected square divided by expected. It will just give you the statistic. And most of the time you also do that simply because the leniency that you have with the other chi-square test, it might also sometimes be a little bit too lenient. Or it makes the test sometimes too strict. Yeah? And that's you can do that in R with the package library exact 2x2, and you have a function exact 2x2. I don't think you use it a lot, but just so you know. Yeah? That was it. I talked a lot about observed versus expected, but that's all there is with the chi-square test. Do you have any questions? No? Is that a good sign or a bad sign? If you also have any questions, well, this may be also general. Do you have any questions with the practical from yesterday with the multiple testing?
We'll get a correction, right?
You will get, you mean like the correct answers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the correct answers for that will be put online. But if there are like questions that you have on multiple testing itself, it's also good to just ask. Maybe one of the questions or one of the assignments you have wrong because you don't really understand a certain concept like FDR or something. Yeah, don't hesitate to ask me. With that, I wish you good luck, or good luck with the practical on chi-square test. I will walk around to help you, and I will also look for answers online. You're welcome. Oh, this is all a different question. Is it better to compare models via the dispersion parameter or via ASC values?
Shall we go? Oh, yeah, you're right. It's a blue First thing to need to I'm not so sure about
Genomic architecture is not difficult. It is a basic course. So basically what basic statistics is for statistics, genomic architecture is an introduction to genetics basically. So you all are on the same level. It sounds very fancy, it isn't.
it sounds super hard.
It isn't, no. At least from what I So yeah, both this, like the for statistics and genomic architecture, there are core modules to get everyone on the same level. For the rest of the course, because they expect you to, know genetics by then. And it's also a good refresher. At least I like that.
There is no other compulsory classes for genetics, so
No, there's not unless you do of course this master, the biotech master. Then you have biotechnology, molecular genetics, and biotech. You're welcome.
Ja, maar volgens mij is het inderdaad bij
Ja.
Dat een beetje een warde haar. Maar ik zei ja, dat ook dit.
Exact.
Maar nu kan ik niet uitleggen wat na dat.
Die expected value. Ik kan het wel laten zien aan de contingency. Volgens mij had ik al gehint dat ik een beetje had gechipt met die table. Even kijken hoor. Hier. Als ik 109 maal 150 doe en deel door 224, wat krijg ik dan? Nee, zie jij wel. Dat staat er, maar dit is natuurlijk doel. En echte waarde is iets van 72,9. Dus de effect is dat wel decimalen zijn. Niet per se afgevoerd. Maar je observeert dat gewoon dingen zijn. Of dat kan nooit decimaal. Je ziet altijd een hele plant of een hele persoon.
Ja, in die zin.
Weet je?
Ja.
Dus expected kan je wel een halve persoon hebben, theoretisch gezien.
Ja.
Maar daar kan het niet. En dat leidt tot die error.
Ah, ik snap het. Ja.
Dat is denk ik wel, ja, dat is denk ik wel.
Oké. Dankjewel.
Ja?
Dat is helemaal duidelijk.
There's also this one.
Not that.
But it's
Oh.
yeah, it's like one. Oh, okay. They're very similar, so always.
Se ci da dire solo
Yeah, that's it. No, I got it.
però non è destinazione.
Okay.
Non ci vedo.
No.
Stare bene.
Dus we zijn nu op dat natuurlijk, ik weet niet of mensen daar gaan zitten, maar ik ga wel kijken. Ja, ik val kost zitten dit lokaal en voor mij is het ook een dit andere lokaal. En ja,
Yeah, I'm looking forward to these values. That sounds crazy. Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah.
Ja.
Dat is het wel.
Ja, precies. Heb jij
Yeah, this is your two entries. You can try what answers to it.
Price space. Heb je wel van Frans?
Oké, maar jij hebt
Oh,
ook
ik heb wel eens van Frans.
Ja, dus je moet doorsturen.
Oh, van mijn laptop.
Je mag ook hier even in als je wil.
Ja, dat zou kunnen. Dan kan je ze gewoon hier vandaan halen.
Ja.
Dus ik kan mijn laptop wel, maar moet ik in mijn laptop wel de stream nog aanstaan.
Ja, nee.
Had je geen account gekregen?
Ja, op de een of andere manier werkt het niet.
Die had moet een van de drie zijn. Ik heb er meer dan die, maar dit zijn de die meestal hier worden.
So we just have to define.
Zeg maar bij Leiden heb je die wachtwoorden. En zeg maar als je diezelfde wachtwoord wil gebruiken, dan zegt hij altijd iets van. Maar hij onthoudt maar die wachtwoorden, dus als ik daar onthoud ik eerst.
Cycle, ja.
Wat doen we hier cyclen doorheen? Kijk, dit is geen price space.
Nog niet, maar als je nu naar Brightspace gaat.
Als ik nu hier, oh sorry.
Ja, precies.
Ja, het is zo normaal. Het ook niet copy-paste. Dan was dit niet. Dan wil je nog even snel. Dit is van vorig jaar. Oh nee, wat is van dit jaar?
Because we expect like the guys to see everything.
Yeah, that's our expectation.
Yeah, it's like this. So maybe just
Nee, dit is.
Ja, tot dan bij het nog op. Tot, thanks.
Graag gedaan.
I don't know how to type this in, so if you have like, okay, the first line doesn't count. So the results would be like 63 infected and 937 non-infected.
Let's see, what was the
so you want to
Okay,
calculate
100
like
healthy adults, all of which are expected to be exposed to the virus. Is there a significant deviation? So how many, so what would the proportions of, so you have 1,000 people? What would the proportions be of people that are affected or not affected, just in percentages?
It should be 5% people infected and 95 not infected.
and then we should like the
So then what are the proportions if you,
That would be 50, 930. Oh,
you don't have to actually put that one? Oh, you think already, you're actually calculating in your head what the expected is. With the chi-square you only have to give the proportions.
oh,
So you don't even have to calculate that, he will do that for you.
okay.
So you will have to say you have two values, right? And you expect one value is 0.05 and the other one would be 0.95.
So how do you type it in? So P equals,
So P with the C because you're gonna have multiple values.
okay.
And one is, first one likely is 0.05 and the other one. I expect this is what I have, this is observe what you put in. And these are the frequencies that I would expect if I have a total of 1,000. He sums it up for you and then calculates the amount of expected based on the frequencies.
Okay. So this part is correct.
Yeah, this is correct. You can just press enter.
Okay.
Oh, it's very tricky.
vraag je. Ik dacht bij de eerste vraag, ik doe het echt met mijn hand en met R, of met mijn hand en mijn hoofd zeg maar. En dan kan ik wel precies square van mijn kant komen, maar dan natuurlijk met distributie. Die heb ik niet echt bij de hand, dus is daar een manier voor. Dan achter de P.
Oké, we gaan als zeg maar de distributie, die hoef je nooit zelf te tekenen. Als dat misschien dat je een chi-square test value zelf moet berekenen.
Ja.
En daar dan ongeveer moet aangeven waar het zou gaan met de distributie.
Maar er is geen manier om dat zeg maar, dus is daar een code voor of zo?
Er is een code voor. Als je hem zelf hebt berekend, dan is het 1, zeg maar de hele distributie is 1, maar je wil zeg maar de andere kant van de distributie. Dus misschien als ik het laat zien.
Ja, dus dat, zeg maar, de hele oppervlakte is 1.
Ja. Je wil zeg maar, als je die functie gebruikt, laat zien van de cijfer, dat is 1, maar die begint al vanaf hier. Dus wat hier zegt, dan berekent hij deze area. Maar je wil de area tegenover, dus 1 min.
I'm not sure. So we always had like
Oké.
Dat is wel genoeg. Ja. Die hele area, de distributie is 1.
Ja.
En die functie, die ik zo laat zien, die berekent van 0 tot de value die je hebt. Dus stel de value die ik hier opgeef, die is 6, dan berekent hij de area. Je wil eigenlijk alleen deze area. Dus wat je doet is je doet 1 min deze area en dan hou je dit over.
Oh ja.
En dat gaat hier. Ja, ik weet niet of je hem aan wil laten dat je net zoals Harold die dan nog spreekt. Maar
Nee, ze kunnen gewoon via Brightspace vaststellen.
dus 1 min. Oh, hij staat op dat, ja. Heb je een functie gedaan? Iets als over. Het eerste argument van each uit